So next, I have André de Vinck. Um, so if you want to get started with um, the sharing, André de Vinck has a PhD in English and American Literature, MTS in History of Religion. He taught for many years in various colleges, does research in evolutionary semiotics, evolutionary history, evolutionary science, and he has two Journal Big History articles, most recently, Evolution Equals Exchange. Andre?
Thanks, Dave. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I found Alexander's talk really interesting, and the question of logic and big history is actually part of my presentation here, which is actually a kind of preface to my more specific work. It's more of a meditation on the background and history of big history. So, in order to advance the philosophy of history, I suggest that we should rehistoricize the science of history. So I'm going to briefly go over some topics which you all know very well. That Descartes is often described as the founder of modern enlightened science. His mathematic reasoning led him to God as the ideal idea of perfect logic. So, for Descartes, the logic of nature reveals the mind of God. Our subjective, rational minds perceive and analyze the objective mathematic world. In turn, of course, Newton was profoundly influenced by Descartes. He also applied his mathematic reasoning to mathematical physics, to the mathematical physics of nature, famously the universal law of gravity, explaining the elliptical orbits of the planets. And it's in this context that, as Matthew reminded us yesterday, that Turgot and Condorcet began to narrate history as the progress of reason and science. So then, again, at the turn of the 19th century, Hegel took up the enlightened project of the science of history. And instead of beginning with mathematical logic, he began with dialectical logic. But he also began with the rational God of the rational universe. His idealist dialectic of history argues that the absolute mind or rationality of God descends to the objective mind or rationality of nature, and then descends again to the subjective mind or rationality of man. So then all of human history begins with the subjective mind of man, ascending back to the objective mind of nature, and then ascending again to the absolute mind of God. Hence our enlightenment, and hence Hegel becomes the high priest of enlightenment. And no wonder Hegel studied at the seminary, and no wonder his phenomenology of spirit actually just rewrites Augustine's treatise on the Trinity, so that the anthropomorphic Trinitarian logic of Augustine becomes the scientistic dialectical logic of Hegel. And then, of course, Marx turns Hegel's idealist dialectical logic into a materialist dialectical logic. History isn't driven by the unfolding mind of God, it's driven by the hard work of man. And in the capitalist system, the hard work of man is fetishized and commodified and ultimately stolen from the laborer as profit for the capitalist. This is where things turn interesting. In 1859, Darwin publishes his great book on the origin of species. And we often forget that Darwin's book was not only a scandal for every Western religious thinker, but it was also a scandal for every Western scientific thinker, because Darwin not only dethroned the supernatural creator God, but also the natural rational God whose pure reason is manifest in nature. Darwin's metaphorical phrase, natural selection, is a euphemism for competition, struggle, death, overpopulation, dwindling resources, extinction, instability, change. In other words, Darwin transformed the enlightened rational logic of nature into the modern chaotic rhetoric of nature. So again, Darwin's book was a scandal for both the Western religious worldview and the Western scientific worldview. In turn, the post-Darwinian religious thinkers dealt with the scandal of Darwin by reabsorbing his theory of evolution into their religious theologies. And of course, Teilhard de Chardin is the sort of classic example of that. Similarly, some post-Darwinian scientific theorists dealt with the scandal of Darwin by reabsorbing his theory of evolution into their enlightened scientific logic. So, for example, the mathematic genetic logic of evolution enabled the modern synthesis, which transformed the modern scandal of Darwin's disruptive and chaotic historical narrative back into the enlightened norm of Mendel's systematic structural mathematic logic. Now, of course, modern science divides and modern thought divides here between what I call modernism and modern thought. And modernism, as Lowell pointed out so well, describes and continues the thought of the disruptive, chaotic, fragmented notion of consciousness and the world that we experience in the 20th century. But there's also that other trend in modern science, which is to return to that enlightened model of rational, enlightened thought. And I'm thinking this is actually where big history is falling more in the modern enlightened context than in the modernist context. So while the machine gear was the archetype of scientific logic for the enlightened age, the computer transistor is the archetype of scientific logic for the modern age. Our dominant scientific and historical metaphors are cybernetic metaphors. So, for example, in the course of our conference, we've come back again and again to structural theory, computer theory, systems theory, information theory, network theory, etc. As a specific example, the sociobiologists see genes as software and bodies as hardware. And the cognitive psychologists see the modern mind as a computer programmed by prehistorical hunter-gatherer algorithms. As a result, some modern historians see history as successive structural paradigms that unfold in progressive stages of logic, one paradigm shifting at a threshold to another paradigm, one form of complexity emerging from another, one system self-assembling and self-organizing after another. In this way, the ahistorical scientific logic of enlightened mathematics is translated into the ahistorical scientific logic of modern cybernetics. And in order to turn that cybernetic logic back into an historical narrative, we've fallen back on a patchwork vocabulary of stages, shifts, thresholds, emergence, self-assembly, self-organization. So, for example, we talk about systems of particles shifting to systems of atoms, which shift to systems of molecules, etc. In short, the modern history of science and the modern science of history are both lacking a convincing theory of evolution. Instead of beginning with Cartesian objective things in Cartesian rational systems, we have to ask again, how do objective things and rational systems actually evolve in the first place? And that means we have to return to the scandal of Darwin's theory of evolution, and we have to radicalize and advance that theory. We have to break the theory of evolution out of its biological specialization, and we have to write a new universal evolutionary history. And I suggest that big history can be and should be rethought and reoriented as evolutionary history. So, in the main section of my paper, which I won't go into here, I just begin with the general idea that Darwin's theory of natural selection is a metaphor. And it's actually, I have a 5-point critique of that metaphor, which again, I won't go into here. But we need to rethink Darwin's basic first principle of natural selection because, as one evolutionary biologist points out, natural selection has no innovative capacity. It eliminates or maintains what exists. The generative and ordering aspects of evolution are thus absent, actually absent from evolutionary theory. In other words, natural selection is a restrictive theory, and we need an innovative theory. So I suggest that instead of the metaphor of natural selection, I begin my argument with the theory of signifying exchange. And the first sentence of my actual paper, which I'll read briefly and then I'll close here. In the time before time, a quantum exchange of energy burst open this evolving universe, and all the subsequent exchanges of energy, mass, time, space, force, particle followed from that beginning without beginning. As a result, every so-called thing and every so-called one in this universe is actually nothing more and no one less than a coincidental articulation of the signifying relations of exchange. And as a specific examples of which I've cited many times in my previous articles, just think about how genetic exchange has evolved each one of us. Think about how synaptic exchange literally evolves our minds. And think about how linguistic exchange enables this very conversation. And of course, then you go on with economic exchange. And one of the consequences of my argument is that every science can be rethought, can be recognized as an allegory of exchange. So you go through the physics of exchange, the chemistry of exchange, the mathematics of exchange. You come to modern sociologists like George Simmel, who argues that every human relation can be thought of in the terms of exchange. You go back to Adam Smith, who begins talking about exchange. What distinguishes human beings from dogs is that human beings exchange and dogs don't exchange. Marx begins Capital, his classic epic, with a discussion of exchange. So to close, my last thought is coming back to Ken Solis's concerns with ethics. The how did I phrase it here in my last note to myself? The who, what, when, where, how, and why we exchange defines the who, what, when, where, how, and why we are individuals and communities. It defines us as human beings. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Andre. Stephen?
Great presentation. There's so much to say, but yeah, you're right about how metaphors and symbols are very important for human thoughts, and it reminded me of one line of thought that's going on even in strategic studies about how there's like complexity or what one colleague of mine is calling chaoplexity, and I'll send a link in the chat
Mm.
for everyone to read about that. And also, I couldn't help but think, were you influenced by Henry Bergson's creative evolution theories at all? Because I know he argued similar about this, like, and especially in reaction to pure Darwinism and all that.
Yeah, I don't agree. He's got elan vital is his shtick and a kind of phenomenology. Again, I see that as a euphemism, not an explanation. I think, again, you got to go to Darwin to look for the actual explanation of how things actually evolve. And that's why I think we need a semiotic theory of how things are exchanging literally from the quantum level to the level of genes and synapses and minds and conversations and us, and then put that in an historical perspective. And again, the notion of time is critical here because we're coincidental and co-evolving. So you and I happen to coincide at this moment in history, and it's through billions of years of incredible series of exchanges from the quantum level to the genetic level to the synaptic level that I greet you, across the millions eons of time, and we coincide historically at this moment, which is why even, the empirical theory of the universe is somewhat ironic because if you think about a rock, which you can take and hit yourself in the head with, well, if you sit in the time machine in H.G. Wells' story, even the rock will eventually disintegrate and reintegrate and go back to its forms of energy and matter. It's a form of exchange. It's a coincidental form of exchange.
Yeah, thank you for that thought. And I just posted the link
Thanks.
for you
Yeah,
and also for everybody because it's actually kind of interesting how scientific ideas and metaphors and all that kind of interrelate. It is focused on like strategy and war, but still it reflects how this interplays in one aspect of reality.
absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good. Ken Baskin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andre. You're talking about pretty much what I'm talking about, which is the paradigm shift. And we see it really clearly today in biological evolution, where the modern synthesis that was invented in the 40s, yeah, and is extremely mechanical and perhaps best representative in Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene,
Yes.
has become the extended synthesis, which really is wild and indicates that you can have. I don't like the word exchange because it sounds too economic. I'm sorry, but it's definitely that there's all this information that's going back and forth, and there's all this connection. Life is not a machine, and I think part of the problem was when science started in the 1600s and 1700s, people were still completely traumatized from the 30 Years War and 150 years of religious conflict. And part of what happened as a result is they wanted order, and the machine gave them order, and they started thinking in terms of the machine.
Mm.
And so I just wanted to say that because I thought that was important.
Yeah, and I would agree with you too that the evolutionary biologists themselves are not stuck in the cybernetic version. There's been a huge reaction against sociobiology and cognitive psychology, and in fact, there's a whole school of thought that's trying to develop the notion of process biology and get back to the notion of an historical temporal dynamic rather than a structural system.
Very good. Thank you. Ken.
Yeah. Of course, it's just a matter of terminology. My complex information theory, actually, the very last figure I have in the book is exactly what you talked about, the exchange. So I just use the terms of information because it gives me more verbal tools to convey things. But you're right. I couldn't quite understand, for example, on the level of physics, how it is that information is exchanged between the fundamental particles. It's this back and forth of photons between electrons and the nucleus. But you're right, it's a hierarchy of information that's being exchanged from the very fundamental level to higher levels. It's just that in my theory, again, I use various types of information, and not everything is physical. So the meaning is not found in the physical world. It's something that springs from an advanced neurological system like our brain, and also brain of other animals, and even semiosis too. I argued along with some others that you need to extend symbols down to the level of bacterium, and that not just anthropocentric. Probably the best representation I've seen of exchange that's occurring is in a movie called Lucy with Scarlett Johansson. It's about 10 years ago, and there's a very brief scene where she's on the street and she's seeing all this exchange of information between street lights and people in cars. It's I couldn't reproduce, I couldn't find it on the net, but it's a wonderful representation that I couldn't duplicate with my simple drawings. So I think we're talking same. I just again choose to use information because it allows me to bring in also Claude Shannon's surprise information, which is a subset of semantics, and I think it's coincides with the Cartesian duality between the physical and the non-physical. And I've always wondered why those who ponder free will and say, well, it's all material, it's like it feels a force not material, anyway, I agree. I just used a different, slightly different terminology. But you're right. Yeah, it's the exchange of things that I think is very prominent in making the universe what it is and making it interesting. Otherwise, we would just have the cosmic microwave background.
Yes, and I appreciate your bringing up the question of material versus immaterial, because if you take the theory of exchange seriously and take it to its radical nth degree, as I just gave the example of the stone, you put that in the context of big history, of evolutionary history, and even a stone is just a coincidence of energy and matter, or energy and mass at a particular moment in time, and we happen to coincide with it. So when you throw that rock at my head, it'll crack my skull. But again, in the time machine of big history or evolutionary history, we recognize the incredible energetic, dynamic universe that we live in, which is constantly evolving. And so everything at one level is no thing. It's just a relation, a dynamic relation of exchange, which is my ultimately radical evolutionary argument, which does work from the quantum level. And one more point I'd like to make is I think that part of the confusion of where semiosis begins and where it ends, and where exchange begins and where it ends, is based on the confusion of value and meaning. Meaning is what we think about in terms of human philosophy and thought and rational consciousness. But value is a more universal idea. For example, for even a microbe or whatever, it's value in reacting to an area where it's too dry and it can't get water, to perhaps being in an area where there's more water and it can thrive and continue, is a value. It's a certain value that microbe will pursue. And same thing for, it makes me think of Alexander's talk too, that I believe that there's a kind of innovative exuberance of exchange that begins with the exchange of energy and mass at the very beginning of the universe. And that innovative exuberance enables a particular range of further exchanges, and it makes another range of exchanges impossible in our particular universe. So you have the possibility cone, the impossibility cone, which leads to the probability of the next series of exchanges, which leads to our particular universe, which leads to our particular possibilities of even our existence. So those are just some thoughts that you inspired.
Very good. Carl?
I mean, sure, it's clear this exchange is enormously important, but I think production is also very important. Alone the fact that bacteria started somewhere locally, I guess, at one of these hydrothermal events, and then apparently distributed all across the planet. You can find them in rocks everywhere. So this duplication, this production of organisms, basically now you need the production first before you can exchange, or vice versa. But production needs to be there, and in human psych, we when you go through the anthropogenesis, I mean, I think the externalization of intentions, making a tool, for example, or then the way we actually get energy is the first form is creating fires. I mean, just the process to create a fire, what is behind it, externally, what you're thinking and what you now put in the world is really essential for the whole evolution of us as a species, because what you're actually doing is you're creating two trajectories, revolutionary trajectories in my mind. You use you get the substitutes for biological organs, teeth and claws, with tools. Now, claws and teeth can go in one bite, your teeth are gone, but a tool you can always replace. So this, again, reduplicating something that is normally would only be there for you as an organism is basically what brings us more and more on top of of this whole situation. Why do we come out of evolution as the only being that knows that we make history? We are the ones that can actually do stuff. I think it's almost like a singularity to explain this, because the other one with the fire is you now substitute your metabolism, you digest food outside of your organs. And when you look at the comparison with chimps, there's this gut-brain ratio flips. Our intestine is only 1/4 of what the chimp have, and our brains is basically 4 times more what the chimps have. So it's actually only through basically using fire do we grow our brains. And when we look at the hominization, it's based on hybridization. We're coming from, part Neanderthal, part Denisovans. There's some pre-Neanderthal, even now detectable in our genes. So, yeah.
We're at 10:30 right now.
Thanks. I just wanted to quickly respond that I don't think in terms of production. I think in terms of articulation. That is, the relations of exchange articulate different kinds of material things, from genes to us. And it's that dynamic of exchange that articulates everything in the universe. And I think precisely Marx's mistake is that he shifts from the dynamic of exchange, which he so brilliantly analyzes. That is, it's through the exchange in capitalism that the human labor is stolen from the human laborer. And he shifts to this dialectical logic of successive modes of production. And ultimately, the communist mode of production is going to save us and bring us into some utopia, where he forgets to talk about, well, in that communist mode of production, if a dictator like Stalin comes along, and that's not exactly the best mode of exchange that we want to live under. So I appreciate the notion of production, but I prefer the notion of exchange articulating history.
Well, just one little response. How do we start to know what the wood is like? Take, for example, an axe. If I start hitting different types of wood, I'll learn which one is hard, which is soft. You can actually only over this labor mediated by energy and tools learn about what the world is like. So
Right.
and that is, so you need to basically make that tool first and keep it. The complete difference, people always say, oh, animals use tools too. They don't, because tools is something that is a permanent thing that we bring into this world. And you sharpen that axe when it becomes dull, because we have another hammerstone doing it. So we are mixing, when we're doing this, we're mixing this up. Animals don't do this. They don't keep a tool for events to come. They don't start fires, you know what I mean? There's something about us that is definitely unique, and we need to figure out what it is. I do agree with you. I mean, information and then getting to this point where you can now self-reflect on what are we actually doing here? What is this world about? I mean,
Mm.
it's absolutely clear. That's where exchange has to happen all the time. And people have to basically, even at maybe they couldn't communicate and speak yet because this voice box wasn't used. Over time it comes, but then it's clear, if you have language, you can talk in absentia about anything. It
Mm.
is unbelievable, the tool we gain there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I really thought that the big history, kind of one of the goals was to develop universal evolution, and Andre kind of talked about that. And I think going all the way, at least back to Eric Johns in his 1980 book, Self-Organizing Universe, really talked about that. And the basis of the different kind of mechanisms of evolution were on the information basis, right? Genetics, cultural genetics, and then cultural type of things. And as you said, natural selection does not generate the new things, but it selects for the new things that come out of the mutations or self-directed evolution that we're kind of now in, that we can humans can create things and see what works and what doesn't. And so it's the combination of, some, fluctuations, errors, or hopefully better directed ones, and the natural selection picks them out. And a lot of the tough questions come at what spatial and temporal scales does natural selection work, right? Is it, at the organism scale, the social scale, and then is it, within a lifetime or within some society time? And I think that's what we're really coming down to now, is that we've been, speeding up and using what works. And boy, oh boy, that it doesn't seem like it's going to be working for long. And so are we selecting for just the short scale, or for a longer time scale there? So
Mm.
I really think universal evolution and, information as a key is important and continues to be important. So I really like the discussion on this.
Thanks. I just wanted to say quickly that I agree. Of course, big history has always been thinking in evolutionary terms. I guess I should have made the distinction. I'm trying to argue for an even more radical theory of evolution. That is, if we're talking about self-organizing and assembly of systems, where does that self-organization come from? What drives that? And where does the system come from? What drives that? And so I'm just trying to suggest that there's an even perhaps more radical level. And you're right. I that's why one part of my critique of natural selection as a metaphor is that it's incredibly ambiguous and confusing, even for in Darwin, as to which level it applies. Does it apply to genes? Does it apply to variations? Does it apply to subspecies? And the confusions around all of that. Plus, I didn't get into it, but as an anthropomorphic metaphor, natural selection kind of implies that instead of God the Father selecting, who will be redeemed, it's Earth the mother who's going to select her progeny. And Darwin gets stuck in that metaphor because he does that wonderful introductory chapters where he's talking about breeding and how we do select animals and plants and for agronomy and husbandry, and that is very effective. So we get stuck in that metaphor. It's a kind of anthropomorphic metaphor. So I don't really care for natural selection. I prefer the idea of a kind of dynamic of signifying exchange that triggers this signifying semiotic universe.